But first, after 5 days, a dozen witnesses, and 30-plus hours of testimony, it was endless, the impeachment hearings ended up a total bust. And despite public opinion turning against them, the Democrats are so far out on the ledge that I think they feel as if they can't back away from moving forward. Now, they're likely considering the following articles of impeachment. The first one is this generic abuse of power.
The focus remains on the president's stunning abuse of power that relates to his pressuring a foreign government to target an American citizen for political gain.
He doesn't even seem like he believes it. Of course, none of the witnesses that the Democrats produced actually had direct evidence of anything approaching stunning, let alone an abuse of power.
President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the meetings.
The president didn't come up, or the Bidens, or any of these investigations?
No, it did not.
Did you ever talk to President Trump in 2019?
No, I have not.
And you were not on the call?
I was not on the call.
Second, Democrats could charge bribery.
My colleagues seem to think unless the president says the magic words, I hereby bribe the Ukrainians, that there's no evidence of bribery.
That is soliciting a bribe, and that is an impeachable offense.
The devastating testimony corroborated evidence of bribery.
They just say this stuff. There is no evidence of bribery. It's patently absurd. Even Congressman Will Hurd, by the way, Republican, who's retiring, and he's not a huge fan of the president, rejected that argument during yesterday's hearing.
An impeachable offense should be compelling, overwhelmingly clear, and unambiguous, and it's not something to be rushed or taken lightly. I've not heard evidence proving the president committed bribery.
Oh, it's just, I mean, I'd laugh if it weren't so bad for the country. Now, the third potential article of impeachment, contempt of Congress.
Article 3 in the Nixon impeachment articles, contempt of Congress. You are obstructing Congress in our role. And Donald Trump goes way beyond Richard Nixon.
Well, if hyperbole were an Olympic event, he'd be draped in gold right now, okay? I think it's contempt for Congress, not contempt of Congress at this point. Well, Trump's been more forthcoming to Congress than Obama. Of course, when he was under the spotlight, did more press events, done more interviews, made himself more available, certainly sent out more tweets. Ridiculous. And finally, Democrats could try to charge Trump. This perhaps is my favorite of the faux charges, obstruction of justice.
They keep taking it to court, and no, we're not going to wait till the courts decide. We can't wait for that because, again, it's a technique. It's obstruction of justice.
This, again, is perhaps the most pathetic charge of all. And it's another sign that the Democrats are just out of steam. A president invoking a time-honored privilege, like executive privilege, his legal right, is now obstruction of justice, obstruction of Congress? If so, then everybody out there, you better buckle up because politics is just going to get uglier and uglier as time goes on. Devin Nunes perhaps said it best.
When the Democrats can't get any traction for their allegations of quid pro quo, they move the goalposts and accuse the president of extortion, then bribery, and at last resort, obstruction of justice.
Now, none of this is working. And I think deep down, Schiff, Pelosi, and their impeachment backup singers, I think they all know it. But in one final desperate effort to win over a weary nation, the chairman of the OSO board did his best to belt out a grand finale.
They were silent when the president said that. No quid pro quo. What do you want from Ukraine? No quid pro quo. We can't just get over it. Where is Howard Baker? Not using metaphors. I think we need to consult our conscience. I resisted going down this path for a long time. We are better than that.
I love the gavel at the end. It makes it really persuasive, except it doesn't. Now, does that sound like a man who is confident that his hearings did the job, were really persuasive? Or did it seem to you like it was a performer begging the audience for applause? Joining me now, Robert Ray, former Whitewater independent counsel, and Harmeet Dhillon, attorney and Trump 2020 campaign advisory board member. Robert, the White House is of the mind tonight that the House might not even vote ultimately on impeachment, but I think they're pretty far out there on that ledge to back away. Where do you see this going?
I do too, Laura. I think they are out on that ledge. I mean, the only exit ramp would be consideration of a possible censure resolution. That's one that's been often discussed in connection with impeachments throughout our history. But generally speaking, there doesn't appear to be an appetite for that. And I think here, the Democrats are too far out on a limb appealing to the interests of the progressive wing of the party. And I think Speaker Pelosi has signaled that she's got to go down this road for fear that if she doesn't, she jeopardizes her speakership after the 2020 elections.
Harmeet, when you hear charge after charge, the goalposts shifting when they weren't getting the public opinion polling that they wanted, they focus grouped this at one point over in the DCC, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. They were focus group using a focus group to determine what the proper article of impeachment should be. And so is there any surprise that Adam Schiff is up there desperately trying to conjure up all this emotion to close it out yesterday?
Oh, no, I'm not surprised because there are no facts to support this effort. But you would think that he might have learned from Jerry Nadler's belly flop during the Mueller investigations and hearings that you have to be prepared and you have to make sure your witnesses can deliver. And his witnesses, one after the other, are writing checks that did not deliver on the impeachment promise. And so if I'm Nancy Pelosi tonight, I'm feeling very worried about my prospects because she has now painted herself into a corner and she has to do something or she'll lose her position and her party will lose at the polls. But, it's going to be a dud and dead on arrival in the Senate, Laura.
Now, Robert, one more point. I want to go back to that issue of obstruction of justice because, again, they're frantic, in their efforts to tie this back to Nixon because people think, oh, if it's like Nixon, it's got to be really bad, and then he's going to resign, and then we're going to be happy. So it's obstruction of justice because he would invoke an executive privilege to not appear before the committee. How dangerous a precedent would that set moving forward, Robert?
Well, it's horrible because this is an inter-branch dispute, and since when is filing a lawsuit, could that ever be considered an act of obstruction of justice? I mean, that really, quite frankly, is a ridiculous notion. That's an appeal to the to another branch of government, a court, to make a determination as to whether or not a privilege applies. You can argue about whether or not it's appropriate to file a lawsuit, but the contention that merely by filing a lawsuit that's obstruction of justice is a ridiculous notion.
Yeah, but Nancy Pelosi made it clear that she's not going to court. We don't have time for that. If it's such a critical issue for the country to wrestle with, for Congress to wrestle with, she'd go to court because she'd be confident she would win, and she would want the legal precedent. Would she not, Harmeet, on this? The legal precedent.
Well, the court system is part of our branches of government, and it's an integral part, and it's part of the due process system. And so I think she's just whistling past the graveyard, Laura. She knows that she doesn't have the goods, and a court would kick her out because it's not there isn't the evidence to support what they're trying to do here. So again, Laura, this is a political process. That's how the founders made it. And all of these Democrats need to be thinking a couple of steps ahead as to what happens when the voters, who are clearly bored, turned off, or otherwise, kind of revolted at this prospect of these Democrats spending their time on this and not on the people's work. Who's going to be held accountable? It's not going to be Donald Trump.
Robert, Republicans now say, at least the White House is saying through the counsel's office and various reports, that they want a Senate trial.
These proceedings have been anything but fair. The Senate has an opportunity to fix that. I am confident they will, and I look forward to them completing the job that we could have done here.
Now, apparently the president is saying, I want a trial, but, Robert, is this something the GOP itself should want?
I don't think so. Look, I think that the trial in the Senate is mostly about a deliberation over whether or not the president should be removed from office. The evidence really is already in. I mean, I could foresee, for example, Lindsey Graham through the Judiciary Committee subpoenaing Hunter Biden and getting deposition testimony. But recall the Clinton impeachment. There wasn't live testimony before the United States Senate. There were a limited number of depositions, and that evidence was shared with the senators. But mostly, an impeachment proceeding before the Senate is a trial proceeding, a deliberation. The president would present a case in the sense that there would be statements, as would the impeachment managers who would act on behalf of the House. But live testimony is not what I imagine that we would see before the United States Senate. And I think finally, after a couple of weeks of this, since the Republicans have control of the chamber, I would imagine a motion to dismiss would be properly filed and considered, and we would, end this and short-circuit it without the president even having to put on a defense.
Harmeet, speaking of this, they're talking about the Lindsey Graham opening this probe. He's chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a probe into Biden Burisma. Now, he's demanding that the State Department turn over all the communications among former Vice President Biden, Hunter Biden in Ukraine. And this is all in response to these allegations that Biden, remember, pushed to fire that prosecutor general, Mr. Shokin, just to end an investigation of that company that employed his son, paid him $70,000, $80,000 a month. Here's how Biden reacted to this today.
I am disappointed, and quite frankly, I'm angered by the fact he knows me. He knows my son. He knows there's nothing to this. Trump is now essentially holding power over him that even the Ukrainians wouldn't yield to. Lindsey is about to go down in a way that I think he's going to regret his whole life.
What do you say to him?
I'm just embarrassed by what you're doing.
Harmeet, Joe Biden, who talked about punching in reference to domestic violence the other night, said he's embarrassed for Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, right. I mean, Lindsey Graham is not beholden to the president. Lindsey Graham has stood up to the president when he feels that's appropriate. And this is entirely an appropriate inquiry. And anybody who knows the son, I mean, you can just see the soap opera playing out on television to know that there is definitely something fishy about that guy ever getting $80,000 a month for anything. But, Biden is, I don't think, thinking very clearly about how this looks from afar. And that brings me back to the Senate. These senators have a conflict of interest, Laura. A lot of the Democratic senators are going to be grandstanding for the cameras and mugging and having nothing to do with, whether this is really
hold on, Harmeet. I think this is an important point. And Robert, we got to go. But isn't it true that the senators cannot speak?
That's
at
right.
the trial?
That's
they don't
right.
speak. They just sit there like potted plants.
That's
Real quick, Robert.
In the trial, but not outside. I mean, so as we've seen,
right.
I mean, it's all going to be mugging for the cameras outside.
Of course.
You're absolutely right.
But Robert,
right?
They can't, during the proceeding, they don't say anything.
That's correct. I mean, again, largely this is a deliberative proceeding, which is to arrive at a verdict about whether or not to remove the president from office.
Preposterous.
And the Democrats don't have the votes. So, what are we doing?
Yeah, well, the Republicans think it's good for them, but I think you never know what's going to come up in one of these.
Everybody should have their interests on the best interests of or their eyes on the best interests of the country.
Yeah. Robert and Harmeet, great to see you tonight.